The pandemic has accelerated the trend of some people moving out of large cities. So we're here to talk a little bit more about that and what that means for the future of some of these big cities. We want to bring in Sofia Song. She's Gensler's Global Cities Lead. And Sofia, it's great to speak with you. We've been talking about this for a number of months. We're based in New York City. We all know, I think it's safe to say, someone that has decided to uproot either themselves, their entire family, and move outside of the city. So what does this mean just for the future of some of these big cities like New York? And will it ever be the same?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think things will be the same. I think things will definitely improve as people get vaccinated and economies start to reopen. But I think some kinds of things will remain that we've seen throughout this pandemic. But cities will recover. I think what we've seen during this pandemic was that the impact on cities was not the same across cities across the board. Clearly there were some winners and losers. We found that, people wanted to move away from these large global cities. They were looking to move to smaller, less dense, more affordable, safer cities that offered a better quality of life. And so, clearly the winners that we were seeing were these smaller, mid-tier cities. And they were actually experiencing a boon, in fact.
Who was it who moved, though? Was it the wealthy? I keep reading stories in the New York Post about a bunch of 60-year-olds who've all gone to West Palm Beach. Whoop-de-doo. They got a lot of money, but bring in the young to New York. Who moved?
So what we're finding is that it's primarily the millennials. It's, in the City Pulse surveys that we had conducted, we found that it was the millennials that were really driving the move. And that's because they were, during this pandemic, they were the most likely to have lost their jobs. They're the most likely to be living paycheck to paycheck. And they were also the most likely to be living at home with young children.
So, Sofia, when we talk about what it's going to look like 5 or 10 years from now, when we talk about some of the demands and how consumer behavior has changed, what is that going to look like?
So when we conducted our City Pulse survey, we found that people were comfortable going grocery shopping. They were comfortable going back to work, going back to school, and similar to the previous guests on your show, they're also comfortable going to hotels, right? What they're not comfortable doing is, what they're not comfortable with is how to get there, right? So using mass transit, flying on airplanes, attending large public gatherings, those were still huge sources of anxiety for people. And so at Gensler, what we're seeing is that these are actually areas that are ripe for disruption, right? So it's rethinking things like mobility and transit. What we saw in this pandemic was that we saw this rise of micromobility in cities. And so if you take micromobility, instead of thinking about transit-oriented development, you could think about mobility-oriented development, where you're connecting transit to bike stations, scooter stations, shower locker facilities, and even EV charging stations, for example, charging infrastructure. When we think about workplace, for example, we found that over half of U.S. workers want to return to a hybrid model of working, right? So, not going back to the office 5 days a week, but maybe some days at home, some days back in the office. And so what does that mean for the physical building, the physical office building? Yeah. And what does that mean to employees and to companies? And then in turn, what does that mean for, the future of central business districts, right? So that we'll see these shifts in behavior and shifts in how we value things.
All right, Sofia Song, Gensler's Global Cities Lead. Thanks so much for joining us today.